Okay, great. And there seems to be a real range of experience as well with people who've joined. So from people who've only just started quilting to people who have been quilting for a long time. Hopefully you're all going to get something out of doing this class. Everybody will be able to make this quilt. Even if you feel worried, if you feel like your 1/4 inch seam is not working, if you feel like you can improve on your 1/4 inch seam, it's going to make your other quilting life a lot easier. Scratch with what you do with
the problem with the connection. Our connection keeps going in and out.
Oh, okay.
Wireless connection.
Does it?
But keep going.
I'll be okay. Okay. So we'll keep going. If we lose you, then we'll just restart. Hopefully the connection's going to hold up. I expect there's a lot of people on the internet right now. So, as I said, my name's Sheila Christensen. I started quilting about 12 years ago in New Zealand. We're on lockdown, so no shop, no online orders. So we thought, well, let's do some online classes and at least, let you keep up your quilting while you all your stash to sew. So this is the quilt that we're going to make. This simple squares, and it has a sashing in between the squares. So I'll just talk about the different parts of a quilt. So this is usually a quilt will either have just whole pieces in these areas, or that might be a block. So you might piece a block in a future quilt. This one we're just using whole squares. The pieces that go in between are called the sashing, and the bit that goes around the edge is called the border. And you can see that right at the edge here, it finishes off with a binding. So that's the very last thing that you're going to do. Your backing fabric, we're losing it, is your batting or wadding. So I'll just repeat that because we lost the signal a little bit. So you've got your border here, your binding here, your backing, and then in between is your batting or wadding. And we'll talk more about those later on. So just want to talk about what's happening today. While I'm talking, you're welcome to ask any questions. Carl's holding the phone, so forgive us if things go a bit shaky, but he'll be following me around as I'm moving around. You can ask questions as we're going along. The aim today is we're going to get to the point where you're going to be able to make your rows. And then we'll do another class next week where we're going to start adding the sashing. So I'm going to try to be as thorough as possible so that you really get a feel for what you're going to do. So if you've managed to download the notes, you'll see a few notes about using fabrics for quilts. Obviously you can make a quilt out of any fabric, but you will find that the more you do involved piecing, the more you want cotton fabrics. So we always recommend cotton fabrics to start with, and cotton fabrics come in lots of lovely prints. So I'm going to show you some of these prints.
Watch the video over and over.
Yeah. So, and don't forget that you will be able to watch this video again if you get called out or you miss a step, then you'll be able to go back and watch the video again. It will be posted after we finish. So this one is a quilter's cotton print. It's been printed on one side of the fabric, and you can see that it has a right side and a wrong side. You'll also find around solid fabrics. So these are dyed fabrics, and they are the same on both sides. This one is a batik. So this is a tighter weave than your normal cotton fabrics. They're hand stamped and done with wax resist and dyes. So those are good as well. Also, you can get woven fabric. This one is a quilter's linen from Robert Kaufman. It's a beautiful fabric. When you're a beginner, some of the woven fabrics are harder to work with because they tend to fray a lot and stretch more. But these quilters' linens are pretty good, Essex linen rather. So choosing fabric for our quilt, I've selected some nice blue fabrics. I've got a lovely range. Luckily I have lots of fabrics that I've bought over the years, and I've picked out for the ones values that I've got. So value is whether it's light, medium or dark. So if you look at these ones, these are quite light, and these ones are mediums and darker fabrics. This one would be quite dark. And what that does is if you put a fabric next to a different value of fabric, you get contrast. So if I put those two together, you can see a clear line between the two. So usually when you're making a quilt, between the different parts, you want to have some contrast.
The screen is locked up. Is that you or me? We're not locked up anymore.
Okay.
That was a question.
Okay? Oh, the screen is... Oh, it must be you, I guess.
Steve, it's you. We're locked. We're going on and off, so...
Okay. So what I've done is I've picked a light fabric for my sashing. So the sashing is the bit that goes in between the squares. These squares are not going to touch each other, so they can all be quite similar. I've got big prints, I've got smaller prints, I've got things in one direction, all sorts of different prints. And then I can divide them up with my sashing that's going to go in between. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to talk about
hang on a second.
80 questions.
Hang on a second.
Yeah.
I know that you guys are having problems with the screen locking up and what have you. Sometimes it's you and sometimes it's me. I'm getting a flash every once in a while that says that we're the video or it's a little bit too much. However, we are going to go ahead and post it. So if you miss something, don't worry about it. We are recording it. Hopefully this will all work out and everyone will be able to get back on. We've got 33 online right now. So hang in there. If you end up getting locked up, you'll come back hopefully. So we'll continue on now.
Thank you, Carl. Okay, so looking at the tools that we're going to use. I know a lot of you have probably got some tools already. I've got a cutting mat. This one's a new creative. That's
trying to reconnect.
Okay.
That's all right. Go ahead.
Yep. So this is the new Creative Grids cutting mat, which has got markings on both sides. And I've got this ruler. This is the Creative Grids. So I like this because I've got the full 6.5 inch width. And I need a cutter. So this is my rotary cutter. This isn't an alpha cutter to change the blade, because to change the blade all you do is click that back and it comes out. So you don't have to unscrew anything. These blades are really, really sharp. So if you've not used one before, or even if you have, do take great care with them. They are razor blade sharp, and we don't want anybody to have to go to hospital, especially right now. So this has a safety guard on it. When I pull back, the blade is out. When I push it forward, the blade is on. You can also get cutters where you have a little button and it releases. So, and then when you let go, the safety guide comes on. Most quilters use this size. This is a 45mm. You can get smaller cutters. This is the most useful for most people. Then the other things you're going to need, some pins. This is the lovely pin cushion made by Brenda for Carl. And I've got these lovely fine pins. I really, really enjoy using the very fine clover pins. They're great. They slip in and out of the fabric very easily.
Linda, we won't know about the batik until we get back into the shop in 4 weeks. So we'll have to refer you to call us then about that batik, whether we have it in stock or not.
Okay. And these scissors are great. You just need scissors for cutting thread really at the moment, but these are my go-to scissors, Karen K. Buckley scissors. Okay, shall we get started doing some cutting? So I see people doing cutting in all sorts of different ways when I go out and teach different groups, and it's quite interesting how one group of quilters tends to cut in the same way. I often see people cutting this way. Cutting is to stay safe and to also be stable so that you can be as accurate as possible. So the thing that's going to help you with that if your fabric, width of fabric, so it comes off the bolt like this, it's got the two selvages here, it's got a fold.
Slow down.
I put the selvage towards me on the cutting mat, and then I take the fold and I bring the fold and line it up with the selvage. So sometimes this edge is going to be quite off if it's not being cut really straight to the selvage. But if you line these up, you'll have this straight of grain. The grain is the way the fabric is woven. So then I'm going to cut on the right hand side and just make a nice neat edge. If you're left-handed, you'll be cutting on your left-hand side. If you're right-handed, you're cutting on the right for this trimming cut. So I'm going to get my ruler, and what I do here is I line up. Can you see this line here on the ruler? There we go, I can see you now. So that makes everything just stay straight and perpendicular. So I'm looking at that fold and lining up a line from the ruler on there, just to make sure that I'm going to be straight onto the fabric. I also just make sure that I'm going to get rid of all the bits of fabric on here. So all the layers, I'm going to be cutting something off. So with your rotary cutter, with beginners, a lot of the time when they first try, they're a little bit, you're going to hold your ruler very firmly with your fingers spread out like this, and then you take the safety off your cutter, place it there, and if you can see here, I've got the ruler sticking out a bit before my cut needs to start, so that I can start before the fabric. So I'm going to take that, and I'm holding the rotary cutter at about 45 degrees. So if you hold it like that, you're in danger of doing this. And if you hold it like that, you're not going to get a good cut. So up about 45 degrees. And the other thing is that you're straight on this way. So if you bring the camera around here. So a lot of people have a problem if they're like this or like that. So you want to be straight up and down there and 45 degrees up from the horizontal there. So then I put my finger on this finger guard here and I push firmly right through. And then before I put the cutter down, I put my safety on always. Then I put it down. So that's cut that little piece off there. We'll throw that in the bin. Okay, we've got a lovely straight edge now. We're going to take that straight edge and we're going to flip it over to the other side. And then, because this is a 6.5 inch ruler, we're cutting 6.5 inch squares. I can use the width of the ruler. So again, I'm going to line this up. It'll line up against where I cut my edge here. That's the important thing now. Hold it firmly, safety off, start a bit before, push through, safety on, put it down. And that gives me a 6.5 inch strip. Now, some of you have got rulers that aren't 6.5 inches wide. If you have one like that, what you can do is if you fold your fabric down again, you can place your ruler this way, and then you can put 6.5 inches. So 6.5 is here. You can put that there.
That's a quarter.
No, that's 6.25 with the white one. Okay. That's 6.5. So then you can cut through like that and do another strip. And if your blade is nice and sharp, it'll be very easy to cut that nicely.
There's a little bit of discussion about the pins going on.
Pins.
What size are they, and so on
Okay.
and so forth?
So these are Clover brand. I think the number is 2507.
Oh.
They're called Clover Fine Patchwork Pins, glass head. And yeah, really nice and fine, and they're great. And if any of you are coming to class on Thursday, they're fantastic for that as well. So I use those a lot. Right, now, if
Don't you cut the salvage off?
No, I don't yet. Not yet.
That was a quick.
No, I like to keep the salvage on because I know where I am then. So I'll cut it off in a minute when I'm cutting my squares, but I keep it on for now. And that way I know that when I'm cutting these strips, I can put the salvage towards me, bring this down, and I know where I am. It keeps me in order. Some of you are going to be working from fat quarters because not many people, a lot of people have fat quarters in their stash, and you'll probably have found that you don't necessarily have meterage. Some of you will, but a lot of people don't, and you might not have exactly what you want for yourself for your sashings, but we can get around that.
So what's a fat quarter?
So this is a fat quarter. This is an American fat quarter. So it is half the width of fabric by half a yard. And let me see if I've got I don't know if I've got a Kiwi fat quarter here, right here. This might be one. So in New Zealand, we work in meters, and our fat quarters are fatter. So these are half a metre by half a width of fabric, so they're a little bit wider, quite a bit wider than American fat quarters. But you will get what you need out of American size fat quarters. So using a fat quarter, basically I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to put the selvage towards me. So, oh, the selvages are so pretty now, aren't they? Look at that little snail. So cute. That is really sweet. So I'm going to put that towards me, and then I'm going to bring the other end of the fabric down to it. And because that's been cut halfway, this should be straight of grain. So if I match that up with my selvage here, I'm just going to match it up with these little dots, little holes. You'll often find, like here, that it's going off. So I'm not going to match these edges, I'm matching these edges, and that keeps everything straight. So I'll do exactly the same thing. Lining up this line up here with the fold, making sure I've got enough to cut everything off. Let's get this cutter. And then I'm going to cut right through, safety on, and that's trimmed up. Flip it over. Just make sure those stay in line with each other. Put my ruler back on. And cut right through again, safety on. So now I have a strip that's 6.5 inches wide, but what I want is a square. So if I open my strip out, I'm going to keep the selvage right-handed. I am actually left-handed, but I now can cut both ways. So I'm going to keep the selvage on the end that I'm not cutting. That way I always know what I've got. And then I'm going to place a line. So the ruler is now going to line up along here, and it's going to line up down here. If it doesn't, you might have to square things up again. But this is going to be nice and square. You can see that okay? Any questions at the moment? Or are you all right? Okay, so now I'm going to cut some squares. So one square. Move along my strip. I didn't iron this very well, did I? But at least the ruler presses it out. It's good to give your fabric a nice press before you start. 2 squares. Line it all up nice and straight. 3. On every fat quarter, you'll get 2 6.5-inch strips, and you'll get 3 squares from each squares, plus some extra. that you won't be using for this quilt. And then for full width fabric, one strip will give you 6 squares. So if you have 2 strips, you'll get 12 squares. There are 63 in total squares in the quilt. So the other thing you might be doing is, if you've got a stash but you've cut into some of it. Where's my Amy Butler? See if I can find that one. Oh, I might have put it to one side. So you might find that you've got pieces that you've already cut into, and you can cut squares from those pieces. So as long as you've got 63 in total, then you'll be fine. Okay, so you've got a big cutting joint. The other thing you're going to cut is your sashings. Don't throw those away yet, by the way. You're going to use them in a minute. Right, this is my sashing fabric. So it's quite a big piece of fabric, and people freak out sometimes about, it's too big, how am I going to handle this? Then they start opening it out. Don't need to open it out. So I'm going to do the same as I did before. I want my selvages lined up with each other, and then I'm going to bring the fold, let's give it a shake, bring the fold and let the fold meet the selvage. And then I can put it on the cutting mat, and this side of it I don't need to worry about at all. I can forget about it. I just want to make sure that this side is lined up nicely. Okay, so we're going to do our trim on the right first. So lining up against the top there, making sure I've got fabric there that I'm going to cut, safety off. Also, it's often people try to cut when they're sitting down, and you just don't get the pressure sometimes. So if you're struggling, standing up is the best way to do it. And then I'm going to take this onto the other.
Trying to reconnect on ours.
Okay.
So.
We reconnected?
If you find that we're losing out, we apologize. It's probably our signal that's having a little bit of a problem. We'll try to correct that for the next class.
Yeah. Are we back on again? Okay. So I've trimmed one side. I've flipped my fabric over to this side and make sure it's still all lined up. Our sashing is going to be cut 1.5 inches. So I'll take my ruler and I'm going to put my 1.5 inch line on the edge here. Nobody's asked me yet why I don't use the mat to cut with. The reason why I use the ruler is that it gives you consistent measurements. I've found it good for measuring. Oh, we've lost again.
What is the ruler called?
Okay, R612. That's the one that you need to look for this one. One of the nice things about it is it measures in both directions. So whether you're left-handed or right-handed, you've got measurements that go up to 6.5 this way, or if you're this way on, they go up that way. And the same in the other direction. The black, you can know whether you've got to use the black or the white marks. And they also have these grippy pads on the bottom so they don't slip. If you're looking at Creative Grids rulers, if you've ever seen these little codes, if you put that in your camera, it'll pop up the top with a website address and it'll show you a video on how to use the ruler. So that's always really handy. Okay, I've cut my 1.5 inch strip, little strip. So what we're going to try to do today is get you to the point where you've got all your squares cut and you've got all your vertical sashings cut. So those are the pieces that go in between the squares. And then you'll have the week to play with how you want to arrange your squares.
Which ones are we cutting first?
So we are cutting these ones first. These are just little strips. So I've cut my 1.5 inches. Now with this one I am going to cut my selvage off. So I've put my ruler lined up with a line on the cut edge here, and I'm making sure that I'm going to get rid of everything of the selvage, including those little holes that take it through the machines. So that's my neatening off. And then I'm going to flip it over. And I can put my ruler on here, line it up. So I'm lined up here at the edge and on top here. And I'm going to cut my 6.5 inch sections. So I'll get 2 pieces there.
Do you wash and iron the fabrics before using the ones?
I don't wash and iron my fabrics. Some people do. It's a matter of choice. With some fabrics, some of the darker batiks, like red ones, they can bleed. And so it's good to wash those sorts of fabrics beforehand. If you're worried about it, wash them. But I've not had anything. The only thing I've ever had bleed on a quilt was my very first beginner quilt, where I'd bought a fairly cheap dark red, and it bled a bit when I washed it, but I still love the quilt, so it's okay. But if you're doing something where you've got a big contrast between red and white, maybe you might want to wash the red fabric before you start. You can also do a little test. So you can test wash a piece with something else in there that will catch the dye, and that way you'll know whether you need to wash it. There's a couple of reasons why I don't wash mine. One is I'm always impatient. Secondly, I often have pieces that are pre-cut, and so the more you wash them, you lose bits at the edges and they tangle up together. Actually, there's another reason as well, and that is because they're nice and crisp when they're made. They have a sizing on them, and I like the feel of them. So some people like the feel of them when they're washed because they go softer. So it's really personal preference whether you want to wash your fabric or not. Okay, so I'm just going to show you this 6.5 inch cut on the sashing if your ruler is not 6.5 inches wide. So here I'm going to use the black markings on this ruler. So there's our 6.5. I'm going to pop that on there. See how that lines up nice and straight there and there. And then cut my sashings. So you will get 6 vertical sashing pieces out of each 1.5 inch strip. And I think I put in the notes how many 1.5 inch strips you need. So you need 54 pieces. So that must be 9. I don't know. My maths is not working this morning. We're not supposed to have to do maths, are we? We're in holiday mode. Okay. So, got the sashing. The next job is going to be to start sewing. So, you're going to sew a sashing piece onto the right-hand side of most of your squares, but not all of them. So let me just explain that. Once you've decided how you want your squares to be arranged, you take a row and you're going to sew one of these vertical sashing pieces onto the right of square 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and 6. So we've got 7 squares in a row and we've got 9 rows. So the first 6 in each row want a piece of sashing sewn on the right hand side. The last one doesn't need one because it's just next to the border. So that's what we're aiming to do this time, is to make, so there's a row next week, because I'll show you how to line them up nicely. So to sew them on, we want to make sure we get our seam correct. So the idea in quilting is that you cut your pieces to a certain size, you sew a certain size seam, and then everything will come together as intended. With a quilt like this, so long as you're consistent, you'll be fine. But as you get more complex and you start making quilts with smaller and smaller pieces, this 1/4 inch seam becomes really important. So it's good to practice it and to get it right if you can do that. So a good way to practice your seam, remember I said don't throw this bit away? We're going to use these to practice our 1/4 inch seams. So we're going to cut 3 pieces where we know how big the pieces are, and then we're going to sew them together, and then we're going to measure. We're not going to measure the seam itself because when you fold over your fabric, you actually lose a tiny little bit. So if you've ever heard about people talk about a scant 1/4 inch seam, that's what they're talking about. It's a 1/4 inch, but you need to be about a thread over from it because that thread is going to be sitting there in the fold. But don't feel confused by a scant 1/4 inch seam. If you do this way, you don't have to actually measure your seam.
Do you cut your sashings from the full width or from the full length of the fabric?
From the full width of the fabric. So the sashing strips I've cut from the fabric with the selvage towards me, so that when I cut that way, I'm cutting the width of the fabric. We will be joining some pieces when we do our sashing going across. Okay, so how much have I got here? Let's see. I can cut a 2 inch. I think let's do it this way round.
Cut this way. Short ones.
No, I'm going to do a
Yeah, I know. Go ahead.
this way on. There we go. Doesn't matter if there's a little bit of selvage in this. I'll use it. So I've cut this piece strip to exactly 2 inches. So be careful with your cutting, make sure your cutting is accurate. I know these are accurate, these are 1.5, but these are not as critical. It's this one that we need to be a known size. So if we cut that 2 inches and then we sew 2 strips, one on either side, then we should know whether our seam is correct when we measure it. So we're about to go over to the sewing machine, so we're going to do a bit of moving now. Ooh, can I do it without the chair? Let's bring the chair round.
Alright guys.
There you go. Okay.
I'm going to come over on this side of you.
Yep. So use the sewing machine you've got. My sewing machine has, so this Janome, I have a 1/4 inch foot that fits onto my AccuFeed. That's nice. I like using this AccuFeed all the time. That's just me. This over here, this was my machine that I had before. So this was my machine that I had before I had the big fancy machine. This is the 1/4 inch foot on there. So a 1/4 inch foot will help you. The 1/4 inch foot has a little guide on it, and you use it to know where you're going to run your fabric. Okay. So on most machines, when you're going to use a 1/4 inch foot, you keep your needle in the middle position. On my machine, it actually has a 1/4 inch setting, so it's moved my needle across. The important thing here, at this point, is to make sure your edges are completely lined up here. Once you get good at doing it, you don't need to pin, but if you want to pin, you're certainly welcome to. I know many very experienced quilters who are still pinners. So I'm matching up those ends, and I'll probably pop a pin in the middle as well, and that way this won't gape. I moved my foot earlier, there we go. Where's my thread? Caught. Of course it is. Yay! There we go. So I'm using the 1/4 inch foot as a guide, but I'm not pushing my fabric up against it. I'm just eyeballing. So I'm trying to make sure I'm sitting straight opposite the needle and I'm looking straight as I'm sewing. And I'm moving my pins out before I run over them. Now, one thing that a lot of people do, and I still do it, is what I call a happy seam. And that's where you go, oh, I'm nearly at the end, and you go, whee, and it all goes off. And then this is the critical part where it's going to join the next seam. So you might have perfect seam back there, but if you don't keep it straight all the way to the end, it might not work. So I'm going to keep my fingers on this side and keep holding it until it's gone all the way through. Okay. So there's one sewn. I think I did quite a wobble at the beginning, didn't I? There we go. And then I'm going to sew the other one on the other side. The pins in the middle. There we go. I think that was because my thread was being funny last time. So notice I'm not pulling from the back, I'm letting the machine feed it through. There we go. I've got my iron set up. So let's go and
go.
Oh, that's frustrating. I've got my pin cushion, so don't stand on it. Right, now it's time to press my seams. So because this is lighter, I'm going to press the seams towards this fabric. So whichever the fabric is I'm going to press towards, I'm going to put on top first. And then I'm just going to press the stitches in like that. Then I fold it back, open it out and press and make sure that that really opens up. And the important thing is to press and not to do this, because that will stretch your fabric and it'll, especially when you start doing triangles, it'll be really creasy and horrible. It'll be bendy. So I'm going to sink those stitches in, the dark fabric on top, push that to one side and make sure this is opened out. So it's very easy to press a pleat in here at this point. So I'm pressing down. Okay, moment of truth now. I'm going to put the ruler on top. So this was 2 inches. I've sewn a 1/4 inch seam on that side and a 1/4 inch seam on that side. So in theory, if I've done it right, this is going to be 1.5 inches. So there you go. And I've got a little wobble down here, but I'm not going to worry too much about that. So if I put that on there like that, so you can see I've got that's my 1/2 inch point. So that's my 1/2 inch point and that's my 2 inch point. So we've got 1.5 inches. Now, if I'd sewn those seams, too big, what would happen would be it would come further over and my middle would be too small. And if I'd sewn the seams too small, this would be too wide. So that is really a good exercise and it's really worth taking time to practice. Takes a little bit of getting used to and practicing, but once you've got it, you'll be really up and go for all your quilts. Now, why does that matter? Okay, so if you think about the number of seams that we've got here, so we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 seams. So if each of those seams is 1/8 of an inch out, we're going to be nearly 2 inches out across the row. And that's why you're trying to work to get that seam correct. But as I say, if you're new to quilting and you're really worried about 1/4 inch seams, don't worry, because you can make this work. It will work, whether you get your 1/4 inch seam right or not. But if you can be consistent, it'll work a lot easier. Okay, what else have we got to talk about? So just going to talk a little bit about arranging your squares, because that's what you're going to do.
Oops, sorry
before
guys.
Next week. So you can arrange your squares how you like. If you've got a big difference between your lightest and your darkest squares, so in this quilt here, there's some pretty light squares and some quite dark squares, well, medium. But there's a contrast between those squares. So you want to get some sort of balance. And in here, our lovely Maria made this quilt. And so she's actually put them in order so that every fabric goes down like this in a diagonal. So that is one way to do it. If you've got so many fabrics, you start with fabric 1, fabric 2, and so on. And then she's followed them on. She's introduced a new fabric down here so that you've got some diagonal lines. You can just be completely random. You're probably just trying to maybe not get exactly the same fabric all clustered up in one corner. That's the main thing, is just to get some sort of balance over the whole quilt. So has anybody got any questions about sewing your rows? I haven't shown you the next step actually. Just when I talked about sewing these rows here, where you've got your square with your piece of sashing that you're going to put on all these first squares but not the last one. When you've done that, you can join your squares together. So if this was my next square, I can then pop that on there and join it, and so I can actually create my whole row, and there are 9 rows to do all together. Yay! I think we got there. Any questions? Don't forget, you will be able to pop onto the group and have a look at the video again, type in questions, we'll try and answer them. We're going to do this again next week. Now, timing may change because I think our clocks go back this weekend. So we'll check the timing and we'll post that in the Facebook Live group again. And I hope you've all enjoyed yourselves. And yeah, we'll see you next time, if not on Thursday when we're doing the triangles. So have a great week, everybody. Stay safe. Here's a little view of New Zealand in the rain for you. Garden. Yeah, we'll still be here.
Whenever I get over here, I disconnect.
Okay.
So